Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. Donald Trump has never been much of a poker player. He is incapable of finesse or modesty and broadcasts to the heavens faults and character flaws that other politicians would try to mask. Trump's brand of contempt and grievance operates most successfully along the fault lines of the most contentious social and economic issues in society, where his supporters burn with resentment at perceived hijackings of their just desserts. A long blueprint for reactionary change should he win the election, Project 2025, lays out a return to a perceived antediluvian American life with far greater involvement of religion, read Christianity, and no officious federal bureaucrats to disturb the order. It's all right there in black and white, but it doesn't seem to have moved the needle of American voters, a scant percentage of whom have even read it. No issue seems to strike a chord with the Trump faithful more than immigration. He leads with confabulated accounts of mayhem on the Texas-Mexico border to crowds in New England and Michigan. A centerpiece of the Project 2025 plan is sealing the borders and ousting illegal aliens in this country on a scale never before seen. He engineered the defeat of a bipartisan proposal for immigration reform in Congress, precisely to be able to campaign against Biden and a broken system. Biden, who recently issued a tough-on-the-border executive order to try to wrest some of the rhetorical advantage from Trump, this week tacked in the other direction with an order giving 500,000 alien spouses of American citizens a path to legal status. Finally, it's June, and the culture wars have their loudest explosions at the United States Supreme Court, where the uber-conservative controlling bloc on the court, at least half of whom was appointed by Trump, is poised to issue closely watched decisions in a bevy of areas that dovetail with the overall reactionary agenda of Project 2025. The court this week issued a decision on guns with the sane result of permitting states to take firearms away from violent domestic offenders, but in doing so revealed the flaws in their previous gun jurisprudence. In the next 10 days, the court will issue decisions in the areas of abortion, the administrative state, the punishment of homeless people, and of course, immunity, where its leisurely consideration of Trump's appeal has all but ensured that he will not face a trial and accountability for the January 6th insurrection before the election. To look down the barrel of the most contentious issues facing the country and analyze how they are playing for purposes of the most consequential presidential election of our lifetimes, we welcome a fantastic group of legal and political analysts, all returning guests to Talking Feds. And they are Gloria Borger, CNN's senior political analyst who appears regularly on Wolf Blitzer, Anderson Cooper, really all of CNN's flagship shows. She previously was CBS News' national political correspondent and a contributor to Face the Nation, and still to the network's special events coverage. Great to have you back, and thanks for joining, Gloria.
Sure, my pleasure.
Dahlia Lithwick, a senior editor at Slate, where she writes about courts and the law and hosts the Slate legal podcast Amicus. She is also an MSNBC contributor and author of the book Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America, which we covered before in our Talking Book series. Welcome back, Dahlia.
Good to be back, Harry. Thank you for having me.
And Jen Rubin, an opinion columnist for The Washington Post, an MSNBC contributor, a previous labor law attorney for 2 decades. Jen's the author of the book Resistance, How Women Save Democracy from Donald Trump. Thank you, as always, for joining, Jen.
My pleasure.
All right. I wanted to try to get our hands around a topic that we hear a lot about, but always in a daunting way. It's 920 pages long, and that is Project 2025. You know, we know from history that most autocrats come to leadership positions by stealth, and then execute their power grab. So it's remarkable that we keep hearing about this tome and as a blueprint for many of the radical changes and self-aggrandizements that Trump intends to implement if elected. So let's try to bear down a little on what Trump is plainly forecasting should he win another term. Let's start here. So the driving force behind Project 2025 is the Heritage Foundation. Who are they and where do they fit into American political life?
They used to be a respectable conservative think tank. Washington is filled with these places. They're akin to, in some way, respects college campuses. They have scholars of various types. They live to be relevant in the political venue. They put out position papers. They hold seminars and the like. And for a long time, the Heritage Foundation was really within that tradition. In fact, when Ronald Reagan came to office, they came up with a compendium of kind of to-do things for the then conservative party. Well, they have now gone full MAGA to the extent that they actually flew an American flag upside down over their building. They are now ground zero for most bad ideas that the MAGA folks have circulated, both in the immigration sphere, where they're really at the far right in terms of wanting to round up and deport undocumented immigrants, to really slashing not only things like the education department and the energy department, but really going through bureau by bureau, division by division, and eliminating functions of government. Their tax policy has always been a kind of trickle down, and it has gotten more so. And whether it's abortion or really any kind of domestic policy, they are at the far right. What is most surprising to me as a former Republican is how radically they've shifted on foreign policy. They used to be cold warriors. They used to be in favor of Ronald Reagan's peace through strength. They were big advocates of the NATO alliance. And now they've gone whole hog Trump. And that exemplifies the hypocrisy, the complete about face that much of the Republican Party, practically all the Republican Party, has gone through.
Are they leading the charge, Jen, or are they sort of in the wake? Because I know there's 100 organizations involved in Project 2025.
There are, and it's like a who's who list, but someone has to do kind of the heavy lifting, and that is kind of the intellectual core. Although I don't know who exactly penned each one, I kind of think everybody sent in their to-do list to Heritage, and they kind of whipped up this document, which, as you say, is 900 plus pages. And by the way, I think that was very strategic. If you make something 9 pages, everyone can read it and recoil in horror. If you make it 900 pages, nobody reads it. And that's exactly why they did it.
Look, I think the theory of the game is that during Trump's term in office, the folks who were around him were neophytes and didn't know how to deal with what they call the deep state and how to destroy it and dismantle it. And there's a sense among these folks that they're not going to make that mistake again, that they're going to come into office, feet on the ground, ready to go. And this is how they're doing it. And that they won't be fooled again. And Trump is all for it because he believes, as we all know, that he was listening to the wrong people. And that these people are people who listen to him and take what he says as the gospel and then translate it into policy. So whether it's mass deportations or the dismantling of the federal government, they're going to do what he wants and they're going to be prepared. I think that's sort of the key, which is preparation. We're not going to waste our time here.
It's a really great point. And we forget how Trump kind of stumbled out of the gate at first in 2017, had a few self-inflicted wounds, but other just missteps. To this day, seems bitter at having to fight the deep state and won't get fooled again, et cetera.
I have just 3 quick additions to the smart thoughts just put forward. One is your initial thought, Harry, which is you don't usually say the quiet parts out loud. Usually, you can spring it on the people. That's how this was done in 2016, right? They came out the chute with the Muslim ban, but they didn't tell us, that everything was coming. So what's fascinating is the paradox here of they're telling us explicitly in granular detail what they're going to do and that nobody knows about it. I mean, the data on how absolutely across the boards, across ideological lines, it is true for Democrats as much as Republicans. When you say Project 2025, it registers nothing. It's not a surprise that John Oliver, people are now trying to make folks understand that this is all there in black and white. But the fact that it has not been salient for months now, I think is really fascinating. The other thing that is absolutely fascinating to me is that this actually is the materialization of the fact that Trump has no ideas of his own, right? This is the same group that they farmed out to do all the vetting and all the placement of justices and judges, right? I mean, this is so, were it anyone else, the idea that a bunch of other groups, it's not actually even embraced by Trump. They're very, very clear that this is for whichever Republican wins. So to me, it is so strange that this is not Trump's ideas. This is the ideas of the fringe right wing of the Republican Party and the conservative legal movement. And they don't care whether it's Trump or someone else. And it goes to who is driving the bus and who is using whom, because this is their plan. And the fact that Trump will embrace it because Trump is completely transactional about all things, to me, is the really staggering part of this. This is not the Republican Party platform. This is not Donald Trump's promises. This is a bunch of outsiders who know that Trump is theirs.
To Dahlia's point, what is fascinating is that Trump has no policies. He doesn't believe in anything. He was pro-choice. Then he said, well, you should criminalize women who get abortions. Then he was told, oh, that's not bad. So he has to be against that. Then he was in favor of a national abortion ban. Then he said, oh, no, we're not in favor of that. Then he was in favor of, he was going to look at contraception. Then he was told, oh, that's a bad thing to say. I never said we were looking at contraception. He has no views on anything. So the entire narrative, which unfortunately gets reinforced by a media that is used to carrying and covering normal candidates, is what is Trump's position on X? Trump has no positions. Trump is going into office to be a dictator, to get out of his legal troubles, and to seek revenge on his opponents. That's his policy. And so what he's done is then made room for all of these clever people to get their wish list together and to go in there. And it would be very interesting to ask him at the debate, like, what do you think of all these things? And he'll probably say, I never heard of it. And you know what? He probably hasn't. And that's what's so bizarre, is that it's kind of this bait and switch and bait and switch. We know what they're up to. Trump doesn't care what they're up to, but he's going to insist that whatever they want, they get to do, because those are the people who will have brung him to the dance.
There is one point that I think dovetails that he's aware of with the Trumpian narrative. You're right. He has no policies, but loyalty is his paramount principle. And he must know that in there are plans to basically raise the administrative state and put in all these political loyalists. That, I think, is something that he's got to be licking his chops about. Let's us try to get our hands a little dirty with the content, which it's just not easy for a massive document. But it's been summarized as having 4 pillars. And each of them has a kind of euphemistic title, a little bit like Contract with America. Restore the family as the centerpiece of American life. Dismantle the administrative state. Defend the nation's sovereignty and borders, immigration, and secure God-given individual rights to live freely. There's warning signs in each of them, but is there a part of the manifesto that stands out to anyone as especially noteworthy or troubling?
Well, all of it does, but the one point that has always troubled me is the dismantling of the federal government, the being able to fire people who have worked in the government for years, professionals, and putting in their place loyalists. And that is what they want. They want loyalists in the government. And you're not always going to get loyalists if you have professionals. And I think you lose a lot of knowledge and you lose a lot of independence. And I think that's not the kind of government Donald Trump wants, because all he wants is loyalty. That's the beginning, the middle, and the end of it.
And just a quick follow on to what Gloria just said. It's not an accident that these 4 pillars of the tent are the 4 pillars that the John Roberts Court has been aiming at for decades now. I mean, it is none of these things, dismantling the administrative state could be the album cover for this entire term, right? Depending on what happens in the Chevron case and Jarkissi. The immigration stuff, we know how they feel. We know perfectly well how they feel about godliness because Justice Alito just blurted it out to Lauren Windsor. And we know how they feel about the family. So I just want to be super, super clear. This is not coming from nowhere. This is, again, the Heritage Foundation and the same groups that really engineered the takeover of the Supreme Court and arranging to have these cases on the docket. And now they are being imported over to the executive branch. But it's the same project. It's been the same project. And maybe just the last thing I would say is that what is remarkable to me, again, is that every pillar of this project, maybe with the exception of immigration, is wildly unpopular. These are not things you can do through the legislative branch, right? Nobody wants Roe v. Wade to be overturned. Nobody wants everybody in the country to have a gun. So they did it the sneaky way through the court, right? That's how you effectuate minority rule. When you can't get things done through the legislature, you buy the court and you buy the cases in front of it. What is really chilling, just to echo what Gloria said, is the move from taking that very successful model, importing it into the executive branch, and then hoping that nobody notices.
To follow up on Dahlia, if you understand the intersection between authoritarianism and essentially a white Christian nationalism philosophy, this makes sense. You cannot have a white Christian nationalist philosophy dominate in a multicultural, multiracial, essentially secular America. So how do you do it? You have to do it by anti-democratic means. And the one serves the other. You fiddle around enough with voting rights so that only white people can vote, or more white people than there really are as a percentage of the population can vote. You take over the Supreme Court and allow the justices to eradicate climate change provisions because they can. You obliterate the division between church and state in implementing a very Christianized view of America. See Louisiana and the 10 Commandments on the wall. You do that through the courts and through this kind of cut and paste, cherry picked history, because you cannot do it in a multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious society. So the anti-democratic nature of all this is the means by which you get this unpopular agenda through by a party that is now wholly dependent on a very narrow demographic slice of America, rural, white, Christian, mostly men. That does not make for a electoral majority, so you have to go through these other means. But the aims of what they want, which is not just to take America back to the 1950s, we're talking about to the 1860s. That's the legal tradition that Justice Thomas thinks we should be applying. You don't get that through just voting for your congressman and hoping he'll support all this crazy legislation. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to capture the instruments of power in the executive branch and do this by executive decree.
100%. And so all three of you made this point now, and I just want to point out, as someone who's been in the executive branch during changes of administration, you don't have to completely show everyone the door and empty out. It's enough if already there's a cadre of political appointees who come in and throw their new weight around. If there were 10%, 5% of the career service that were just sort of shown the door, others would be very much cowed. And similarly, you don't have to win every battle here either. It's enough that this becomes the thrust of things. And ironically, the point we're making repeatedly, that who the hell reads this thing, will serve as a potential talking point. You knew America, you elected me, and it was all out there in black and white. I had one follow-up to you, Dahlia, about the family piece. So what's your sense of that part of that pillar and what it has as its agenda for birth control, reproductive rights, and the like?
If you look at the bang, 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 what they're doing, it's attacks on IVF, it's attacks on contraception, it is a wholesale attack on abortion rights. In fact, it's turning Biden's efforts to protect abortion on their head so that that machinery will be used to restrict it. So it is very explicitly, and it says so, it's shocking, wants to restore, father as the head of the family unit, subordinated wife. It is a vicious attack on LGBTQ freedoms. So this is really, as Jen says, reinstantiating, an 18th century, 19th century Victorian model of what family looks like, except it comes with a side of clawing back progress in every single sort of iteration of what we think of, not just as equality, sort of like dignitary equality, but economic equality and equal rights.
I think that theme is really pronounced all the way around. So it's not a progressive document. It's like a deeply reactionary document and with full of nostalgia, you could say. And maybe the 1860s were like this, maybe they weren't. But it feels to me like, anger at the modern liberal state. Okay, so feels like an outline for, as Gloria said, all parts of it, disaster in black and white, and doesn't seem to be generating widespread alarm. Jen, you wrote in the Post, ignoring the consequences of a second Trump term amounts to whistling past the graveyard of democracy. It's time to pay attention to the prospect of a MAGA autocracy. And it is. But how do you get voters to pay attention if this express blueprint doesn't do it? What could, or what does the Biden campaign need to do? Maybe starting with the debate next week. Where is this alarm going to come from, if not right in front of our faces as the document has been published?
I think Biden really has to be the one to point this out, and the debate might be a good time to do it if he could quote chapter and verse, although he's not allowed to have notes in front of him. But people's attention need to really be drawn to it. You're right. People just aren't focused yet. And I think it maybe has to come from the president himself.
I think it also is the responsibility of the media. And those of you who know me know that I abhor the excess focus on horse race politics. And the reason is because it crowds out what really matters. And nothing matters more than this. You've had hundreds, probably thousands of polls up until now. None of them mean anything because tomorrow there'll be a new poll and there'll be new events which change those. So instead of all of those 1,000 stories of polls, if you had 1,000 stories on each part of Project 2025, you might have a slightly deeper understanding. Now, I will say this. The problem is not people who watch the media and listen to the media. It's the people who don't. If you look at some of the statistics, I think Biden has something like a 50% lead among people who read a newspaper. So that tells me that it's not the media necessarily which is confusing people. It's that we have an entire population out there, some of whom will turn out to vote, who are completely checked out. And that's why I come back to the John Olivers. It's those people. We have so dumbed down our political culture and made it entertainment. Okay, you got to meet the voters where they are. So that means late night television. That means John Oliver. That means TikTok. That means social media. That means making these things real in some sense, that the person who only pays the barest of attentions to political news will pick up on. So, yeah, the mainstream media has to do a better job, but the campaign and others in the democracy movement have to also engage cultural opinion makers and cultural features. Listen, how many people learned about checks and balances from the media, and how many of them learned about it from Hamilton? The power of cultural media and pop culture is tremendous.
I would add one other gloss. We're in a moment right now in which the normalcy bias is really distorting the American public acceptance of, you can use the word creeping fascism or autocracy or authoritarianism. I mean, you can choose your incredibly alarming word, but there's no question that that's what this is a blueprint for. It's not subtle on its own terms. And Norm Ornstein and I wrote a piece, I think a week ago, and it was rooted in Project 2025.
Great piece.
Thank
Great
you.
piece, yeah.
I mean, I think that the point of it is to say, this is out there. It's not hidden. And yet we are so kind of apt by temperament to say, oh, look, but look at these 34 convictions the system held. And I think that we want to wrap ourselves in the notion that the rule of law will hold, as Jen says, that checks and balances hold, that government holds. And it is the kind of frogs in the pot problem that by and large, all of these systems of law, of governance, of accountability are the things that make us free. And that we have so thoroughly metabolized and normalized that the idea of that architecture will be the thing deployed to make us unfree, like that's the thing, right? It's the checks and balances. It's the law. It's the courts. It's voting. It's government. That's the thing that is really being unraveled in order to harm freedom and democracy. And I don't think any version of that argument has penetrated the national discourse.
And just to add one point to combine what you two said, we know that especially Trump supporters overwhelmingly look to social media, not CNN and MSNBC. God knows I'm a normal flummoxed parent when it comes to TikTok and Instagram, but trying to do this kind of sophisticated argument in that kind of media, man, that's a tall order. All right. Hopefully much, much, much more to come on Project 2025. I wanted to focus on a particular area. That's part of it too, which is immigration, arguably as difficult and vexing as it comes in policy and political terms. So after Biden does his executive order, widely seen as trying to, wrest some of the leverage from the Republicans here, he now has a new policy that's designed to give roughly 500,000 immigrants married to American citizens a pathway to legal status. So I'm just wondering, has he had a kind of Goldilocks, golden mean here, or does this sort of undo the good he did by being tough on immigration? What do you think about these as a package, and why did Biden choose this more progressive move in the close to immediate wake of the executive order?
I think there are two things. One, when I spoke to the administration and the rollout, they were very clear in signaling immigration advocates shouldn't worry too much. We've got stuff coming for them. In other words, it was the intention all along to kind of balance it. If you want to look, as opposed to a political, at least a policy argument, it's that they're going to get tougher on the border to prevent more people from coming in. But for people who have been here a long time, we're talking about 10 years, for example, we're going to treat those people more humanely. So there's a certain policy sense that makes, which also coincides with their political problem, which is they have a great many people in their party who think that immigration is a really good thing. And in fact, we need more of it. Now, I think one area that they have not explored, and Trump has been kind of waffly on this, is to make legal immigration a bit of an issue. Trump keeps saying he's in favor of legal immigration, and he has to say that to his friends in the business community who fall down all over themselves whenever they get access to him. So if Biden would then say, okay, we've done the borders, we're going to treat the people who are here, but now we're going to make our economy stronger by fixing our really screwed up, unbelievably opaque legal immigration system, which is really mind-numbing. The folks at Cato have done these great charts, which is just absolutely baffling for anyone to figure their way through the process. Then he might have something more to offer. But I just think this is a lose-lose for the Democrats. When they're talking about this, they're losing. And I think they have to make some arguments that, in fact, the best argument has been they had a solution and Trump nixed it. And they just have to repeat that 30,000 times. We were in favor of it. This guy wants chaos and he nixed the whole thing. End of story.
The problem is, Jen, that's a complicated argument, right? It makes sense to those of us who were here, who covered it. They had a deal. They had a conservative Republican working on it, who they threw under the bus. And we know that Trump didn't want a deal because he wanted the issue. If you say that enough to voters, it sounds like just more political gobbledygook. We did it. They didn't want to do it. They killed it, and it's part of Biden's problem because anything he does now on immigration, the asylum issue, et cetera, is going to be looked at as suspect. Just like, by the way, Donald Trump saying, I want every foreign kid educated in this country who graduates to get a green card. What? Okay, that looks suspect too, coming from Donald Trump. That the issue now is so fraught. And I've been covering immigration now, for more than a decade, right? At least. And there were so many opportunities that were missed. The public wants something done, but whatever anybody does is suspect. And of course, this is going to be a huge issue during the debate because, they're going to play the blame game here. It's intractable, right, at this point, until you get a Congress that has actually got the will to do something and get something done. And, whatever Biden does, it gets thrown right back at him, whether it's from the progressives on asylum, right? They're having a hard time over at the White House with this issue.
As a policy issue, there are things to be said and balances and nuance. And it does seem to me that a pathway for people who are here is one thing and then crossing the border another. But it seems so hard just in this political crass soundbite way.
And I think the other thing is to bring up what Gloria just did. Trump's supporters would freak if they found out he was offering green cards to all of these foreigners. Biden would be very clever to say, I agree. Why don't you come help me sell this to Congress? And that does two things. One, it puts him on the side of some business people who actually really want this, and he does something for his base. And secondly, it really upsets Trump's base to think that, was he confused? What's he doing? And Trump will, of course, blah, 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 at the debate. So as a debating technique, that might not be the worst thing for him to do.
I also think this is one of those topics, as both Jen and Gloria have said, this is just the hardest, thorniest, most intractable problem that could not be solved when there were grownups in the room and at least some mutually agreed upon definition of the problem and some universe of solutions that we could talk about. The fact that Donald Trump came down that elevator before the 2016 election talking about, strangers, rapists flooding across the border, to kill our little girls tells you how much not only this became a sort of signature template for how to think about xenophobia and racism and all the ways that he has distorted this issue so that it's not about this almost unsoluble problem on its own terms, but now it's just larded up, Harry, with the cartoon version of this, right? That's when Texas sets its own, state immigration policy and dares the Supreme Court to step in. Like, that's happening on these cartoon terms. outcomes. And I think one of the things that is so hard, and it a little bit goes back to, what everybody's been saying about an electorate for whom all the news comes in from TikTok and social media, is how do you acknowledge simultaneously that this problem is one of the hardest decades-long problems that we have allowed to fester and grow worse, and also that it's not the thing that Trump tells you it is, because for once you concede that thing, you're doomed. And I think it's that split screen of serious people take this seriously and cartoon people use it as a wedge that makes it almost impossible to smush into one debate answer.
Just to emphasize that, George Bush came into office. He wanted to do immigration reform. He got more than 70 votes in the Senate. That was not ancient history. That was like 20 years ago. Now, the thought that a Republican president would come in with a signature issue of comprehensive immigration reform and get people of his own party to agree to it is like from another universe. It's another century.
Right. It's the Whigs or something. It really strikes me. I'm not an adherent of the theory that Trump is a brilliant intuiter of the national mood or whatever, but it's so striking. He has rallies in Wisconsin and New Hampshire where the leading point is they're flooding the Texas border, as if anybody would care. But it's been such a visceral, emotional winner for him. I mean, you understand why he scuttled the deal, as sort of, pusillanimous as it is.
You don't need Jews for anti-Semitism. You don't need illegal immigrants for xenophobia. It's always been that way.
Okay, let's leave it there for now because it's the end of June. So other than the long days, all thoughts turn to the Supreme Court. I already see Dahlia shaking her head dolefully. But the court today announced 5 opinions. 4, I think, will not generate much news, but the 5th, Rahimi, will. The court held that the state can prevent adjudicated domestic violence offenders from getting a gun. So let me just serve it up. It's hot off the presses, as it were. Any thoughts about the decision?
Yeah, I'm going to put this in the column of cases in which utterly insane things that shouldn't have happened don't happen, shouldn't be called wins. And it is an absolute piece of ongoing malpractice in the media that this will be characterized either as a win or as a piece of reasonableness, because this is not reasonable. This is, it's 103 pages of opinions, 8-1 decision, the Chief Justice writing, but like very fractious concurrences and unsurprisingly, Clarence Thomas dissenting. But this is a cleanup operation. It is nothing more than an attempt to salvage the atrocity that the court perpetuated in Bruin 2 years ago when it expanded Heller to say that there's a new test in town, and the new pretend old test is that unless you have a historical analog for a modern gun ruling, it is presumptively unconstitutional. That was insane at the time. It opened the floodgates of insanity, right? Courts around the country saying, well, I guess then, domestic violence restraining orders weren't a thing at the founding, so those fall. And, sawing off the serial number on a gun, that law has to fall since muskets didn't have serial numbers. We've just seen 2 years of chaos, and chaos that is, people will die. I want to be clear, this is not doctrine. People die because of this. And this is the court saying, you know what? We actually can't put a thumb on the scale for Zaki Rahimi, adjudicated beater of his partner and the mother of his child, and a guy who used a gun in a string of crimes. And to suggest that that guy gets his gun back because there was no analog for domestic violence restraining order at the time of the founding would have been laughable. But the fact that the court pretends to clean up that Thomas opinion and pretends to narrow it. Oh, now we don't need an analog. We need a historical principle, says the Chief Justice.
Relevantly similar.
Relevantly similar. I guess the only other thing I will say is not only is this not a win, it is a deep embarrassment for the Fifth Circuit that gets spanked again for getting way out over its skis. But more than anything else, to me, this is really, really emblematic of a court that has essentially opened the doors and said, we're open for business. Anyone who wants to bring some batshit new theory, we'll entertain it. That is the bulk of the docket this year, is the court having to correct for its own embarrassment.
And remember, this is the same court that said, no, you cannot ban the bump stocks, even though it looks like a machine gun, it acts like a machine gun, it sort of is a machine gun. So that same court that did that, which is such a sop to the gun people, and which is a Clarence Thomas special, is the same one which somehow turns around and says, well, we didn't really mean that really sort of extreme stuff. You know, the only one who's intellectually honest on this is Clarence Thomas, because he's the only one who says, never nuclear weapons for everyone. He's the only one who's consistent on this.
He applied Bruin's, honestly, and the court was forced not to, right?
Right.
Well, and look at Mifepristone. They decided not to decide because of standing. They didn't decide the issue itself. They decided, okay, there was no standing to bring the case. And Kavanaugh made it very clear, if anybody else has standing or believes they have standing, bring it on.
And it's worse than that, because if you remember, in the school debt relief, they allowed a complete bait and switch to get over a standing problem when they really, really wanted to invalidate something. They allowed an entity that was not really the entity that was making the loans to get before the court because they could get standing. So it is, as Gloria said, it's like an invitation to cheat. They're giving a roadmap the way that Alito gives a roadmap for how to destroy Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. He gives the practitioners a guidebook to how to get past this. And talk about a case that never should have gotten there, that standing of this type for a group of people who never had to give an abortion, who never needed to give an abortion, who only thought in their heads they didn't like the idea of giving people abortion, that should have gotten a district court and the Fifth Circuit is an abomination. Again, why are we to this point? And that's because the Supreme Court has basically said, give it a shot. Take your chances. It's what they used to call free swing. Why not?
And I would say this, and this is important, to the extent that we entered this term on the golden wings of originalism, right? Originalism was going to save us all. It was the only theory, and we just had to apply it in a humble, principled, scientific way. And I think this is the paradigmatic originalism is over case, right? Because if you take originalism to mean what it says, not the principle, but the originalism as articulated in Dobbs, the originalism as articulated in Bruin, Zaki Rahimi had to win, right? There were no domestic violence restraining orders at the founding. And the fact that in tandem with the Anderson, the Colorado case, in which the court, originalism, there was no question. Every historian in the country said Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, it's dispositive, it's over. And yet the court was like, oh no, we don't want to do originalism today. We're going to do purposivism. We're going to do this other thing, which is it's bad for democracy, which is, by the way, what I suspect, going to get in the immunity case, where they're also going to find that originalism, which clearly drives the outcome there. I just think the two big lessons for me from Rahimi in tandem with these other big originalism cases is not only that originalism is bad cherry-picked history, which we knew, but the proof is in the pudding, but it's that the court will pick which kind of originalism it wants to use. And that, if you can pick the test and call it originalism, and there's no principled sort of line between all of the tests, then originalism is just a complete ideology. It is not a methodology.
And the real test is, how much will Amy Coney Barrett and the chief tolerate? That's the real test. When Harry and I suspect when Dahlia were in law school, there was this thing out there called legal realism. And it was this kind of far left theory that you didn't have to understand precedent. It was all about what the judges had for breakfast, what they thought, what their agenda was. And at least at Bolt, we had a zillion professors who would scowl at that kind of lowbrow kind of, realpolitik. Of course, it doesn't matter. You have to learn these principles. You have to apply them. Blah, 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 blah. No, they're right. It's all about what Amy Coney Barrett and the chief think should be. We should forget with briefs and just go up and ask them, like, what's on your to-do list? Because that's what this is all about. Like, what's too far, Amy Coney Barrett? Chief, like, really, what's the point at which the court loses all credibility? Which side is this on? Yay or nay?
Well, let's see what happens with immunity.
Well, let's move to that if we could. What are you thinking about, and what will you be looking for when the opinion comes out in the immunity case?
I was just sort of astonished by the arguments that were made when we were listening to them, because I thought they were kind of upside down, particularly from Alito, because I thought in my naivete that this was kind of open and shut. A president should not have complete immunity from prosecution after he leaves office. So I'm wondering what pretzels they twist themselves into to try and split the baby here and give him some sort of satisfaction. And you guys are the court experts, not me, but I bet that is what has been splitting the court up. And I bet it's why Sonia Sotomayor said she goes to her chambers and cries sometimes, because I think that, this is the most difficult case of all. And to the liberals on the court, it's pretty obvious. I didn't get the feeling at all that it was obvious to Alito, not one bit.
And to Gloria's point, I would just add this. I think it needs to be said that because we continue to cover the court as this like oracular, Olympian branch that like hands down decisions, which we will talk about for one day when they come down and never again, we make the mistake time and time again of thinking that this act of sitting around and waiting for the court to give us an immunity decision is a neutral act. It is not a neutral act. First of all, they could have accepted Jack Smith's invitation and decided this before the D.C. Circuit. They could have summarily affirmed the D.C. Circuit in the winter. They could have not taken this case. They could have put it on the sort of rocket timetable that the Anderson case. They did none of those things. They slow walked this case. So every single day that we collude with the court in this performance of we're just neutrally watching a neutral court hand down a neutral decision about immunity is another day that Donald Trump doesn't face accountability.
Now, as she usually does, Dahlia has just stolen my piece for Monday, or better yet, said it better than I can, because Trump's already won. That's all he wanted. He just didn't want to have a verdict before the election. The American people don't get a verdict. And because if he gets elected, he'll never allow the prosecution to go forward. He'll just shut it down. He doesn't have to pardon himself. He just has to end it. That he's gotten what he's wanted. They've already put their thumb on the scale in the same intellectually dishonest way that Eileen Cannon has put that case in deep freeze. She's a joke. These people are a joke as well. They have deliberately maneuvered.
Come on, Jen, tell us what you really think.
Yeah, really created an artificial logjam to give him what he wanted. So in some sense, it doesn't matter what they say. Big deal.
All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we unbottle the truth about wine. Is there really a right or a wrong way to enjoy it? Wine drinkers near and far have lived by a certain set of written yet unofficial rules to follow, particularly when it comes to pairing wine and food. You've heard a couple of them before. White wine pairs with seafood, red wine pairs with big old juicy steaks. And while we like to think of these more as guidelines than rules, some suggestions actually do serve a higher purpose to help your wine get the most from your dish, and vice versa. One pairing that's not quite as obvious involves tannins. Tannins are the dryness that you taste and feel in wine They come from grape seeds, skin, or oak barrels. Traditionally, high tannin wines and spicy foods don't pair well together. The dry components of the wine become more pronounced with spice, which makes the food itself taste even hotter than it actually is. From drinking red wine with fish to white wine with beef, we say, you do you. But there is one no-no that we wholeheartedly live by. Always, yes, always, hold your glass by the stem and not the bulb. And there are a few reasons why. Putting your warm hands on the bulb transfers unnecessary heat to the wine. As wine warms up, it will become off balance and you will taste the alcohol more and more. Not to mention, you can easily avoid smudges to your beautiful glassware. To truly enjoy wine, you can never go wrong pairing the wonderful selection and helpful guides at Total Wine & More. Cheers.
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's A Spirited Debate. We only have a couple minutes, so maybe let's just end there. We've got some very big cases to come, but as things stand, has the court public standing improved or deteriorated even further?
I thought after Bush Gore that it couldn't get any worse for the court. And I think it has gotten worse for the court. And if you look at all the polls, people believe the court is political, which it is. And I think that what Donald Trump has done is played it like a fiddle and played all of these courts like a fiddle. I mean, this is not to say that he didn't get convicted in New York State, but delay has been his objective. He knew he wasn't going to win. And delay to him is the same thing as winning. And, that's one of the reasons he wants to be president of the United States. So I think that when you look at how this has all played out, and that the only case that has come to fruition is the Stormy Daniels case, you kind of shake your head and you say, Jack Smith is there in Florida banging his head against the wall, that Eileen Cannon hasn't issued any rulings, which is sort of stunning to me. And the Supreme Court took its time on immunity, whatever it decides. Watergate, you guys might know this better than I, but the ruling on the tapes was very fast in Watergate. And that doesn't happen. It's not happening anymore. And so the court, and given the question about Alito and the flags and ethics with Justice Thomas, I think the court has lost its standing with the American public. And I think that's sad. I really do.
The cert was granted May 31st in Watergate. The case was argued July 8th, and the decision came back July 24th. In Bush v. Gore, it was less than a week. When this court needs to move, it moves.
And I would just say one other thing that I think matters. It's not just that it's scary or sad that public trust in the court has plummeted. It's that, I say this all the time now, the court is very likely going to decide the next election in whole or in part. Whatever it is that's coming, it will land on the court's doorstep. The fact that the American people have completely lost trust in the court because of unforced errors, right? It would be bad enough if this was about Dobbs and Bruen. This is about shocking, scandalous, disqualifying ethical misconduct that is not only unreported and uncorrected, but it is sort of brushed away as nothing, as attacks by the public. I weep for what the court has done to its own standing, because we need to have the rule of law in this country. We need to have the public believe that the court is beyond reproach. And I think that their behavior in response to critiques of repugnant behavior across the board has only added to their own sort of self-own. This is on them now and is 100% on them. And it's a tragedy because we are going to need them.
Yeah, I mean, there's almost an element, I'm trying to compare with the Nixon era. But first, I mean, Bush v. Gore, it does seem the analog. There are certain things where the principle really does seem to be political in the rawest sense. But you can't say all the court, certainly not Roberts, I wouldn't say, but there's this element of contempt and indifference and sort of immature, FU to the criticisms that only pour fuel on the fire, but that there you go with life tenure. I'm a misty-eyed former clerk, and it is a poignant era, I think.
I would also point out Congress has fallen down here too. Even the Democrats, who actually have a body, have not passed a mandatory ethics bill. It got through the committee. It's not been voted through the House. At one point, the Democrats had both houses and the presidency. They didn't do it. So this is on the Congress. This is also on the president, who gave the back of the hand to court reform when a commission came up with a report. And ultimately, it's on the voters. Do they want a Supreme Court or not?
That is the ultimate. And now a lot of people say it's on John Roberts, but you think about his going down the hall and trying to, slap Alito or Thomas into shape. It's, just a fantasy. Okay, well, there's on that cheery note, bated breath for what comes next week with half a dozen really blockbuster cases still to come. See what the court has in store for us, and hope you'll be back to talk about it, all three of you. Thanks a lot for being here. We are out of time. Thank you so much, Gloria, Dahlia, and Jen. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. You can follow us on Twitter at TalkingFedsPod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. You can leave voicemails with your questions for me and our guests, whether for Talking 5 or general questions about the inner workings of the legal system for our sidebar segments. All you have to do is call 727-279-5339 and leave a voice message. You can also email us your questions at questions@talkingfeds.com. Thanks for tuning in. And don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McGardle. Our research producer is Zeke Reed. Rosie Dawn Griffin, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers, and production assistants by Akshaj Turbailu and Anna Salvatore. Our music, as always, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of the Lido LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.